Hello, everyone. My name is Rubeena Singh, and I'm a manager of research and knowledge at Kite Insights. I'm so pleased today to moderate the discussion of a paper that Patricia, Gabaldón, and I co-authored recently. This paper focuses on the correlation between legislation against gender-based violence and female political leadership at the national government level. And before we get into this paper, I'd like to set the scene and define gender-based violence, or GBV for short, and share a little bit as to why this topic is important. Gender-based violence is the most severe form of gender inequality, and it can be considered as one of the most pervasive human rights violations. This kind of violence disproportionately affects women and has significant economic, social, and political costs. Gender-based violence refers to violence of many forms, which leads to an abuse of power and sustenance of harmful norms. It affects 1 in 3 women in their lifetimes and can include sexual, physical, mental, and economic harm inflicted in either public or in private. It can also include threats of violence, coercion, and manipulation. Gender-based violence is a serious violation of human rights, and the threat of harm increases when girls and women are displaced. Displacement can occur due to various reasons, including man-made and natural causes. Violence against women can also have negative effects not only on the livelihoods of girls and women, but on the economy as well. Violence against women can cost countries up to 3.7% of their GDP. Violence against women is perpetuated because of harmful norms, which are at a risk of being passed down from generation to generation unless they are addressed. This issue is not just a women's issue. Boys and men play a pivotal role in recognizing the role that they play, the power dynamics between men and women, and together we must form ways and ideas to address these norms in the workplace and at home. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists today. Welcome Susana Malcorra, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Worship, 2015-2017, Argentina, and former Chief of Staff, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Susana is a member and co-founder of GWL Voices. I would also like to introduce here my brilliant co-author, Patricia Gabaldón, Associate Professor of Economic Environment at IE Business School, where she teaches applied economics and country economic analysis. Patricia obtained a PhD in economics from the University of Alcalá, Spain, and she was a visiting fellow at Harvard University. Patricia's research combines sociology and economics to understand gender issues and to help different countries' stakeholders to improve their decision-making. Susana, let's begin with you. Can you give us a little bit more information on the situation of gender-based violence?
Thank you, Rubeena. And let me start by thanking Patricia and yourself for the excellent work you have done on the paper that we are going to discuss today. In a very special day, it's the first time we're going to discuss it publicly on November 25th, 2022, which is the day dedicated to gender-based violence. You have really found very interesting correlations, and Patricia will go into that in detail. But I want to start from the very beginning on why is it that GWL Voices, which I preside, commissioned this work to IE University through Patricia and you, Rubeena. We felt from very early that it is fundamental to address the questions that you describe so well in gender-based violence terms, that it was important to have an understanding of the implications of laws that really address the question. And laws that really make an impact, because often is the case that you have laws that not necessarily make a difference. And that's why we commissioned this work, and we will be discussing the outcome report, because of our conviction that this problem has to be addressed in a systemic way through the appropriate engagement of governments through the different branches, starting with parliaments, which is the question of your report. You mentioned certain statistics, which I'm going to enrich with later numbers coming from UN Women. The UN Women Report 2021 on the question of gender-based violence shows that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, even worsened the situation that you described, Rubeena. It says that 45% of women reported that they or a woman they knew had experienced a gender-based violence during the COVID pandemic. 7 in 10 women said that they think that verbal or physical abuse by a partner has become a common practice. 7 out of 10. 6 in 10 felt that sexual harassment in public spaces has worsened in recent years. So these are statistics that come out of the work that UN Women does on this question that show that we have before us, as you rightly pointed out, Rubeena, a serious case of human rights violation that in a way has been naturalized in many societies. And that's part of the problem. We have to make it visible. We have to talk about it as we are doing today in this very special day, but it cannot be a once a year question. It has to be understood as a threat to societies, not only to women, to the well-being of societies. You talk about the impact on GDP, which is incredible because, of course, this type of harassment and violence implies that women often cannot work or have to take time off or are affected, and that has an impact on GDP. So clearly what we are seeing is that this has to be made visible. It's a problem, it's a human rights problem, but it's not only a problem for women or a problem of women, it's a problem of societies. It requires a cultural shift, a major cultural shift, but it also requires setting up the right frameworks through laws, through procedures that the executive offices apply, and through a judiciary system that closes the loop to ensure that those perpetrators have not recognized the laws that exist are taken into account and are really called into order. But also there is a need to enlarge the number of countries that have laws in this regard. And our duty as GWL Voices is to talk globally and to bring this to the attention of those places where there is still a long way to go in order to have the laws that are necessary. So that will be the initial framework to describe why is it that we are interested and why is it that we are discussing your excellent work.
Thank you, Susana, for sharing that information with us, including the updated statistics as well as the framework for this research report. Next, I would like to ask you, Patricia, to give a brief summary of the ideas and information found through this research. And to frame this conversation, I might add that for the research report, Patricia and I analyzed data from the Women, Business and Law 2021 report and an online demographic data source, which indicates whether the head of national government had been male or female. And for information, the WBL 2021 report is from the World Bank and presents a series of studies that measure laws and regulations that affect women's economic opportunities. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Rubeena. Thank you, Susana. The most amazing thing is not only being able or have been able to have the possibility to research on gender-based violence and the relation or the correlation with female leadership in politics, is also to have this conversation. Like the idea that we're giving visibility to something like this is a big success on itself. when we started talking about this study, when we started like brainstorming about how to deal with this data or how to try to tackle this idea of what is the impact of female political leaders in gender-based violence, we are actually implicitly or somehow looking for a solution, right? What is out there that could help to reduce the suffering that all these women are going through, right? Because at the end of the day, even though we call this gender-based violence, it's violence against women, okay? So we were looking into, well, what are the drivers or what are the triggers that can make these women to have a better environment or at least a softer environment in which gender-based violence could stop to happen or it could be reduced in any way. And this is what was taking us to this stage, okay? This is exactly where we were trying to look for. And we were trying to correlate and to find relationships in between the presence of women in different political leadership positions and the development of these norms, okay? Legislative norms against gender-based violence, like legislation against gender-based violence. And initially what we found, and this was like one of the most preliminary findings, is that whenever we had women getting involved into politics in different forms of leadership, we found that gender-based violence was reduced, was somehow lower than in those countries in which the presence of women was smaller or more reduced or something like this. So there was something going on in there. And then when we started digging into it, what we found is that, well, many of these legislations are probably influenced by the presence of women in these leadership positions. In which way? Well, first of all, what we find is that it's not only it's not only that you need to have a female political leader, like a female prime minister or a female president, to carry the responsibility to change all the legislation against gender-based violence. More than that is the presence of female parliamentarians. So to have a critical mass of women in those countries that are able to change the legislation, most likely not only to change the legislation, but also to be able to create a new environment in which the gender lenses are included. Like, you know, maybe we need to look at gender-based violence as in a specific way that hasn't been seen. This is something that we thought it was going to be super interesting. And actually we find a very strong correlation and sustainable correlation in so many different countries. It was paradoxically something very interesting as well to find that there are actually countries that don't have any kind of legislation against gender-based violence because they were assuming that this was not going to happen in their countries, right? For instance, legislation against child marriage doesn't exist in Iceland or in Finland. What is this telling us? That this is something that they were not even thinking about. And now with globalization and, you know, global migration and everything, is something that probably they need to reconsider as well, right? So what we can say is that actually the presence of women in political leadership positions seems to be one of the antecedents of the implementation of these legislations against gender-based violence. And the strongest correlation, because we were analyzing domestic violence, child marriage, and sexual violence legislation, is not with the presence of women as political heads. The strongest relationship is with this implementation to prevent and stop gender-based violence, comes with the presence of women in parliament. And this takes us to something very interesting as well, because it's not about the political party being in charge. Okay, it's a correlation that happens over time. So very important is to have, again, these gender lenses to try to prevent and stop eventually gender-based violence.
If I may, Patricia, maybe I can chip in here to make this chat a little bit more informal. I have a comment and a question. One comment has to do with violence against political women, which is another aspect which hinders the ability to deliver this type of participation. You use a word that is very, very important. You need a critical mass to be able to move this forward. And when women who want to be in politics face the challenge of being harassed because they want to run for office, for example, and that happens throughout the world, that is a big showstopper to advance these laws. So that's one comment I wanted to make. But I have a question for you on data. How good and how far a gender lens is included in the available data, and how much more do we need to do on data in this regard to really shed light on the problem?
This is well, thank you so much for this question, because this is actually the main reason why we chose the legislation instead of the report of gender-based violence, because it's globally known that gender-based violence is underreported. It's underreported because some people doesn't even recognize that this could be gender-based violence, like whatever they're suffering, they don't consider this as violence. They get, it's sometimes all this violence is even included into the social norms. This is, how women should be treated. And in other cases, it's because there is a lot of shame and yeah, there is a lot of shame and social punishment for women that have been living this violence. So they don't want to report. There is social shame out there. So for sure, what we can tell is that there is a huge underestimation of the data on gender-based violence. This being said, it needs to be reported. Okay, we need to open channels to be able to find and locate gender-based violence, track it, give it visibility, and try to fight it as much as possible, not, trying to push away whatever shame this is bringing, because it's not about shame, it's about violence, and those who are suffering from that, they need to be saved, okay? And this is, following on that or building on that, this is where we're using legislation, because women business and the law is actually able to track whether there are any kind of gender biases within the legislation in different countries, and how, in this case, different gender-based violence are treated. So this is actual fact on this, okay? It's not something that we've been assuming, or that's something that it might be that women feel or perceive that they're suffering, or men in this case, right? Rubeena, maybe you have more information on this, or another takeaway on this?
I think to build a little bit more on what you've just said, I think it's really interesting that the finding on gender-based violence and the relationship or the correlation with women in political engagement was across 3 different forms of gender-based violence: domestic, sexual, and child marriage. And this trend was consistent across the 3 forms, and it was the strongest with domestic violence. And very interesting to notice how domestic violence, which can be so covert, can be so hidden. This is an area that not only men but women are obviously recognizing, and through legislation bringing voice to something that is highly and easily masked, and it's easily hidden and made into something that's a private affair and not related to legislation. So it's very important that we're seeing this overall trend, but also very important, we're seeing an increase in legislation specifically against domestic violence.
Rubeena, you mentioned something that is another a twist that this problem has, and that is the privacy question. It is perceived in most societies, and in some societies it's dramatic, this perception that all these types of violences fall under privacy, fall under something that you should not report. There is a shame question, as you mentioned, Patricia, but there is also a question of you don't talk about that, you don't make it public. So there is a need for a profound cultural shift and a profound empowerment for women to understand that this is against their basic rights, and it has to be a talk about, but not only talk about, it has to be reported. So one of our objectives today to have this conversation and to share this conversation through social media is to call on women to take their bodies and their own selves in their hands, because it's only women who are suffering from this type of violence that can make it clear to the world and have to speak up and report. So in a certain way, the culture, the way of being, the way of living curtails our own ability to overcome the problem. So it's key to report.
I think it's social movements like the Me Too movement had been very successful at raising awareness of violence and given women a voice, had given them a campaign that they could get behind and to share their stories as well. And I think it's not only important for women to share their stories to reveal what's been going on, but also it's also very revealing to the men in their lives who may not have known that this was happening to their friend, their sister, their mother. And what we're seeing is by taking ownership of what's happening, giving voice to what's happening, and moving away from the shame and the stigma, what you're doing is shedding light on an issue that is systematic, that needs addressing in multiple ways. It is not just a women's issue. This is a power imbalance issue, and it affects men too, and not through violence. I don't mean directly through violence, but it affects the relationships with men. And so in order to produce a more equitable, harmonious working relation across different levels of society, this is an issue that is not just, it needs a voice because it affects women, it actually affects all of us. And when we raise this issue, we all become more aware, and we know what we can do to help prevent it and support those who are going through it and prevent it from happening in future by working together and systematically.
As an economist, let me say something here. It's like the business case is so super strong. Like imagine that you have 1/3 of your population suffering from, all the mental stress and all the mental health pressure that implies being abused in any form, right? There is no way that person is going to be efficiently working. There is no way this person is going to be engaged into anything. The relationships, not only the family or individual relationship, their working environment is going to be very unstable. So if it's not only for these people that is suffering from these women that are suffering from gender-based violence, we need to think on the overall picture. How much are we losing by not having these women fully getting into the system, so to say, right? Into the workforce, to be full-time, whatever they want to be, right? There is no way they can contribute to their environment if they are not fully engaging into that. And violence is probably one of, as we said, one of the strongest forms of gender inequality, right?
Clearly, this is not only a problem of rights, of justice, of a social impact, as you said, it's also a problem of economic impact. It's interesting because every time we touch on an issue regarding women, in the end, it has an economic impact. When half the population somehow is affected, you have an impact on the global GDP. There is no question. And this one, you said it at the beginning, is 3.5, the estimated impact. Rubeena, you referred to the Me Too movement, which I think has really made a lot of progress, but it's essentially a Western-centric movement, essentially. And we need to address this, and our duty as global women leaders' voices is to talk about the whole world. And one thing that I noticed in the report, and maybe Patricia, you can speak about this, is that there is a real gap between the developed world and the developing world vis-a-vis laws and the recognition, the formal recognition of this problem. Can you speak a little bit about that?
What was happening, the biggest difference that we found in terms of legislation is that, first of all, developing countries or less developed countries are underdeveloped as well in some of these legislations. Sometimes they don't code for the specific crimes that are very much detailed into developed countries' legislations. The other thing is that in developed countries, usually where is more legislated or where is more detailed legislated is domestic violence. Okay, child marriage and sexual violence is something that is kind of taken for granted, and especially in some countries, it's something that they consider that it's already been overcome, so they don't tackle this that much. And in developing countries or less rich countries, this legislation is more into child marriage and sexual violence. Again, excuse me, with all the limitations that we can think of, right? I mean, and there's something else into that, the enforcement of legislations. This is not something that we tackle in the report, but it's something that we can see this, that the enforcement of legislation is much stronger in richer countries than in less rich countries. So sometimes the legislation is setting the base or is creating the play field. How much this is leveling the play field is a different thing, right?
Indeed, and that's why we as GWL Voices will continue to look into this and go beyond the legislative branch and talk about the executive and the role of the executive, but also the role of the judiciary system to make sure that the loop is fully closed. I think we are pretty much getting to the end. Rubeena, you are the master of ceremony here. Anything you will want to say at this point in time?
I think that I just want to highlight how important that point is that you just raised, that there are cultural differences. Economically, there are differences around the world, but this cultural piece is very, very important and important to pay attention to. It's establishing legislation itself is not going to solve the solution when we know that gender-based violence is deeply rooted in cultural norms or in social norms that require a distangling of how that got to be in the first place and what are the power systems in place that enforce and perpetuate this type of cycle. And what I would like to say just at the end is, while we've looked at the economic opportunities that are available to women and legislation that supports or prevents gender-based violence in regards to these economic opportunities, the World Bank Group Gender Strategy also reveals a conceptual framework that ties the economic opportunities with endowments such as health and education, as well as voice and agency. And I encourage all viewers to have a look at that report as well and look at that conceptual framework, because in essence, what we've covered is just a figment of the bigger picture and the implications legislation can have on all of the different ways of development that are much bigger and much more holistic, and must be addressed. And through that work, we must apply this cultural lens to understand, well, how do these things get started, and what is the impact of legislation, accountability, measurement, tracking, data, etc., to actually make change happen.
Clearly, this is a moment to unite and to raise our voices as UN Women asked for in this very special day, and not only talk about this, but really make a difference in changing the landscape in every possible way. So I really want to thank you for your contribution. I will urge the people who are listening to read the report, and we will continue to further this discussion to make sure that not only the aspects of the legislation that we have seen so far are taken into account, but the larger questions that you just mentioned, Rubeena, and that you referred to also, Patricia. So it's a great moment that we can launch the report, but this is the first of a longer journey that we all have to take together. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you, GWL Voices, for this opportunity, for this ability to do this research. Together we form stronger partnerships with more information, more data. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I mean, it's been actually great to get to know more about the details about everything that is happening around gender-based violence. And let me finish with something, because you've been allowing us to do something very important, that is giving visibility and providing data. Whenever it comes to women's issues, data, right? I mean, let's put numbers out there so to show where the inequalities are coming from and how we can solve them. So thank you very much for that.
It's great to have an economist putting into value how important data is, to challenge those who say, well, that's not happening. Yes, it is happening, and data proves it. Thank you.